His greedy family signed for a $90 million inheritance. They had no idea what was actually left. This is a story about a man who said nothing for 6 years. A man who watched his own family betray him, scheme against him, and count his days. And instead of fighting back the way most people would, he waited. He planned. And when the moment finally came, he handed them a pen. What happened next, they never saw coming.
Frank Nash had not spoken to his family in 6 years when he called the meeting. That alone should have told them something. 6 years of silence. 6 years of unanswered calls, returned letters, and holiday cards that came back marked with a single word, refused. 6 years of Frank Nash living alone in that enormous estate on the edge of Whitmore County, with his books and his silence and his long memory. And then one morning, out of nowhere, his lawyer reached out to all three of them. Bev, Greg, Chloe. The message was simple and cold. Frank wanted to see them. There was a matter of the estate to discuss. Come prepared to sign. They came prepared, all right. They came hungry. The night they signed those papers, a glass of red wine hit the floor of the Nash Estate Library, and nobody moved to clean it up. The wine spread slowly across the rug, dark and wide, while three people stood very still and tried to understand what had just happened to them. Bev had one hand on the desk like she needed it to hold her upright. Greg kept looking at the documents like reading them again would change what they said. Chloe didn't look at anything. She just stood there, her face going through expressions that didn't quite land on any one thing. Frank was already at the door. He didn't look back. He adjusted the sleeve of his coat, gave a small signal to the two men waiting in the hallway, and walked out into the cold. Behind him, the locks were already being changed. The bank accounts were already frozen. The thing that had been building for 6 years, maybe longer, was already done. That's the thing about Frank Nash. By the time you realized what he was doing, he was already finished doing it. If you're the kind of person who thinks about what it means to watch someone lose everything in a single night, drop something in the comments. Because this story is one of those. And if you've never heard of Frank Nash before, stay with this until the end. This one goes deep. To understand the night in that library, you have to go back. Not all the way, just far enough to see how this started. And it didn't start with money, not really. It started with a decision Frank made about 22 years before that signing, when the Nash Company was still a mid-sized operation, and Frank was still a man who trusted people. The Nash Group had been built by Frank's father, Edwin Nash, out of a combination of industrial contracts, land holdings, and the kind of stubborn patience that doesn't really exist anymore. Edwin died when Frank was 38, leaving him the whole thing, the factories, the property portfolios, the shell companies Edwin had used to move money around for decades. Frank inherited it all, including the parts that were quietly on fire. He also inherited his family. Bev was his older sister. She had married into a social circle that required money the way a machine requires fuel, constantly and without gratitude. Her husband, a man named Roland, had died 7 years before the signing, leaving Bev with 2 properties, a lifestyle she couldn't sustain on her own, and a very clear opinion about what portion of the Nash fortune she was entitled to. The answer, in Bev's mind, was most of it. Greg was Frank's younger brother. The kind of man who was always almost about to do something impressive. He had started 3 businesses, all of which had failed at the point where they would have required actual work to sustain. He drove a car that was too expensive and lived in a house that was too big and owed money to people who were getting less patient. He had spent the last decade telling people he was in between opportunities, which is a polite way of saying he had been waiting for Frank to die. Chloe was Greg's daughter, which made her Frank's niece. She was the youngest and in some ways the sharpest, but sharp in the way a knife that hasn't been tested is sharp, impressive looking, not proven. She worked in what she called asset management and what people around her called networking, and she had attached herself to Bev and Greg's financial hopes with the grip of someone who understood that her own inheritance depended entirely on theirs. These 3 had been working on Frank for a long time. Not with aggression, not at first. With the particular kind of softness that people use when they want something. Visits that were really audits. dinners that were really negotiations, conversations about family legacy that were really conversations about money. Frank had watched it happen for years before he stopped responding. He knew what they were doing. He had always known. He just hadn't been ready to do anything about it yet. The silence started 6 years before the signing, after an incident involving the company's internal financial records that Frank never discussed publicly, but that had cost him a significant amount and, more importantly, had told him exactly who had given the access. He didn't confront them. He didn't call lawyers. He didn't do anything that looked like a response. He went quiet, and he started planning. The thing about planning something for 6 years is that by the time you execute it, there is no nervousness left. Frank had run every version of this in his mind so many times that the actual night felt almost routine to him. He had accounted for their greed. That was the easiest part. He had accounted for their impatience and their arrogance, and the way they had always underestimated him, because he was quiet and because he didn't perform his intelligence the way they would have. He had accounted for all of it. What he had spent the most time on was Toby. Toby was Frank's nephew on his late wife's side. He was 29 years old, worked in environmental law, and had no particular relationship with the Nash family other than a few holiday visits and a brief period when Frank had helped him pay for his last year of school. He was not rich. He was not connected. He was, in every outward way, completely unremarkable to Bev, Greg, and Chloe, who had barely registered his existence. That was exactly why Frank chose him. About 14 months before the signing, Frank began making small, visible gestures toward Toby. He had Toby visit the estate twice. He had his lawyer reach out to Toby directly, a fact that Frank made sure Bev found out about, knowing she would tell Greg, knowing Greg would tell Chloe. He had a brief clause inserted into an early draft of estate documents that referenced Toby by name in the context of a primary beneficiary, and he made sure the draft was printed on paper that could be seen, not read, when it was left briefly on a desk during a meeting with an accountant who had a known connection to Greg's circle. He fed them the idea slowly, the way you feed an animal, a little at a time from a distance until they come to you. By the time Frank's lawyer called with the invitation to the estate, Bev had already been tracking Toby's involvement for almost a year. She had hired someone to look into him. Greg had done the same. They had both concluded that Toby was the threat, that Frank had somehow developed an attachment to this nobody from nowhere, and that if they didn't act fast, they were going to be cut out entirely. They came to that signing absolutely convinced that they were the ones making the move. The documents themselves had taken Frank almost 2 years to prepare. He had worked with 3 separate legal teams, none of whom knew the full picture. One team handled the language around the Nash Group's oldest subsidiary companies, 7 shell entities that had been used by Edwin in the 1980s and 1990s to manage waste disposal contracts across 4 states. Those contracts had been profitable, and they had also been illegal in ways that had never been prosecuted because Edwin had known the right people and because the companies were structured to be almost impossible to trace. Almost. A second legal team handled the liability transfer mechanics. This was the technical core of everything. What they were drafting on Frank's instruction was a document that could pass as a standard estate consolidation agreement, the kind of thing a wealthy older man might ask his family to sign in order to simplify asset distribution before death. It looked like a gift. It was structured as a gift. Every visible element of it pointed toward the family receiving a share of Frank's estate valued at between $60 and $90 million. The clause they were focused on was buried in Section 14 of a 41-page document, written in language that was technically clear and practically invisible. It was called the Clause of Irrevocable Indemnity, and what it said in plain terms was this: by signing this agreement, the undersigned parties accepted full, unconditional, personal financial liability for all outstanding regulatory penalties, environmental remediation obligations, and labor settlement debts associated with the listed subsidiary entities. The listed entities were Edwin's 7 shell companies. The combined liability attached to those companies, accumulated over decades and recently activated through a series of legal filings that Frank had quietly arranged over the previous 18 months, was a little over $112 million. Frank's estate was valued at approximately $90 million. The math was simple, and it was final. He had been careful about the activation of those liabilities. That part had required the most patience because the regulatory and legal machinery around old environmental violations moves slowly, and Frank had needed the liability to be real, documented, and legally transferable at the exact moment those signatures landed. He had spent over a year coordinating with environmental attorneys to ensure that the outstanding claims against those shell companies were properly filed, properly served, and properly positioned. He had also spent that year insulating himself. Months before the signing, Frank had transferred his personal assets through a series of legitimate trust arrangements that placed his actual wealth, the real $90 million, into structures that were entirely separate from the Nash Group subsidiaries and entirely outside the reach of anything Bev, Greg, and Chloe would be signing for. The estate they saw, the accounts they thought they were accessing, the numbers in the documents, all of it was a frame around something that wasn't there anymore. He had also prepared for the possibility that they might actually read the document. Not because he thought they would, but because he was careful. The language in Section 14 had been reviewed by a linguistic consultant whose job was to ensure that nothing in that clause would stand out to a reader skimming for the important parts. The consultant had done good work. Section 14 read like the kind of procedural legal language that people skip because it sounds like the boring protection of the company boilerplate that every corporate document has. It was the most expensive-sounding version of nothing that you could possibly write, and it was designed to make a reader's eyes move past it toward the next section, which contained the actual distribution numbers. Human beings look for what they want to find. Bev wanted to find her share. Greg wanted to find his access. Chloe wanted to find the clause that protected their position against Toby. They all found what they were looking for and signed. The signing itself had taken about 40 minutes. Frank had arranged the meeting for a Tuesday evening in late November, which was deliberate. Evenings are harder to think clearly in. November makes people feel like time is running out. He had offered a bottle of wine before the documents were even on the table, which Bev in particular had accepted with the kind of relief that comes from feeling like you've already won. The lawyer who ran the signing was a man named Aldrich, who had been with Frank for 11 years, and who had the demeanor of someone who had chosen his profession specifically because it required him to feel nothing in rooms where other people were feeling a great deal. Aldrich moved through the 41 pages efficiently. He paused at key sections to summarize. He answered the 3 questions Greg asked, which were all about distribution timelines and none of which were about the liability language. When they reached Section 14, Aldrich described it as standard indemnification structure protecting the signatory parties from third-party claims, which was accurate in the same way that describing a loaded gun as a metal object is accurate. Toby was in the room for the signing. Frank had made sure of that. Toby stood near the back, not at the table, dressed in clothes that were slightly too formal for the occasion, holding a glass of water and saying nothing. His presence served its purpose perfectly. Bev kept glancing at him. Greg signed faster than he might have otherwise. The idea that Toby might somehow interfere or that hesitation might cost them their position drove them forward in exactly the way Frank had known it would. The last signature was Chloe's. She pressed the pen down hard, which was maybe the most revealing thing she did all evening, like she was trying to make the paper feel it. And then it was done. Aldrich waited approximately 90 seconds after the last signature before he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his posture. He just asked, in the way that someone might ask if you'd remembered to lock your car, whether any of them had cross-referenced the indemnity clause with their personal tax filings before signing. The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Greg laughed first. The laugh had a sharp edge to it, the kind that comes out when someone is trying to make a feeling go away quickly. He told Aldrich to cut the checks. He was already pulling out his phone. Frank leaned forward into the lamplight. He didn't use many words. He told them what Section 14 meant. He told them about the 7 subsidiaries. He told them the number, $112 million in combined liability, now legally theirs. He told them that the assets they thought they were receiving had already been moved into structures they had no access to and no claim against. He said it the way you'd describe a traffic incident you witnessed. Matter of fact, no particular feeling attached to it. The room changed. It didn't change slowly. There was no gradual realization, no back and forth of denial and acceptance. It changed the way a power outage changes a room. One moment everything is lit and running, and the next moment the context is completely different. Bev reached for the desk. Chloe's glass came out of her hand and hit the floor, and nobody looked at it. Greg went through 3 or 4 different expressions in about 4 seconds, and none of them resolved into anything coherent. They looked at Toby. Toby looked back at them with an expression that was essentially empty. Not cold, not satisfied, not anything in particular. He just looked at them the way a person looks at something that isn't relevant to them. Because it wasn't. Toby had known what the meeting was for. He had agreed to attend as a favor to Frank, and because Frank had explained enough of the situation for Toby to understand what these 3 people had done 6 years ago with those financial records. Toby had no stake in the outcome. He had shown up because Frank asked him to, and because sometimes being asked to show up for something like this is its own kind of answer to a question you've been carrying. Bev was the first to try to argue. She pushed herself back from the desk and started talking about contesting, about fraud, about the fact that they hadn't understood what they were signing. Her voice had a quality to it that was hard to describe. It wasn't quite panic, and it wasn't quite anger. It was somewhere between the two. Pressed thin by the effort of maintaining a composure she no longer had the resources to sustain. Frank was already moving toward the door. He paused once, briefly, to adjust his coat sleeve. Then he stepped out into the hallway where 2 members of his security were waiting. Aldrich followed, carrying the signed documents in a leather folder that he held with both hands, the way you carry something you've been trusted with. The locks were changed that night. The estate's accounts were frozen within the hour, not Frank's personal accounts. Those were already moved, but the shared company accounts that Bev and Greg had access to, the accounts they used as a kind of informal fund for personal expenses that they had been drawing from for years under the assumption that Frank either didn't notice or didn't care. The bank received the instruction at 10:47 that evening and executed it before midnight. The environmental attorneys who had been holding the liability claims filed the formal transfer paperwork before the next morning. The filings were clean and complete and had been prepared weeks in advance, waiting only for the confirmed receipt of the signed documents. Greg's properties were flagged within 72 hours. His creditors, who had already been patient for longer than they wanted to be, received notification of his new financial exposure and began their own proceedings almost immediately. The domino effect was fast because it had been positioned to be fast. Frank had understood that Greg's financial situation was already fragile, that the right additional weight at the right moment would not just tip the structure, but collapse it entirely. Bev's situation was different in the details, but similar in the result. Her 2 properties were leveraged against loans she had been quietly managing for years, and those lenders had been informed through legitimate legal channels that her financial exposure had fundamentally changed. She had 1 week before the first formal notice arrived at her door. Chloe tried to call Frank 3 times in the 48 hours after the signing. He didn't answer. She tried to reach Aldrich. Aldrich's assistant responded with a written statement that Aldrich was no longer available to represent her interests, and that all correspondence should be directed to the relevant regulatory bodies. She tried to reach Toby, which was perhaps the most revealing thing she did in that entire period. The fact that Toby was the person she thought to call suggested that even then she was still trying to find an angle, still looking for a way through rather than a way to understand what had happened. Toby didn't answer either. There is a version of this story that wants to spend time on what came after. The proceedings, the appeals, the details of how 3 people dismantle a life when the financial infrastructure underneath it disappears. That version of the story has a kind of grim documentation to it, a long scroll of losses that might feel satisfying in its completeness. But that's not really the story. The story is about a man who spent 6 years building something that most people would have given up on, or would have expressed differently, louder, angrier, in ways that would have required other people to validate. Frank didn't need validation. He didn't file a lawsuit after what happened with the financial records. He didn't go to the family and make them explain themselves. He didn't even tell anyone outside a very small circle what he was planning. He just put one piece in place at a time, slowly, for 6 years, with the kind of patience that comes from knowing that the thing you're building is real, and that real things don't require rushing. There's something in that which is almost harder to sit with than the anger would have been. Anger is at least relatable. 6 years of quiet calculation is something else. What the three of them had done 6 years before, the thing with the financial records, had been clean in the way that family betrayals sometimes are. They hadn't broken into anything. They hadn't used threats. What they had done was simpler and in some ways worse. Greg had cultivated a relationship with a mid-level accountant at the Nash group who had access to internal financial projections. Bev had provided the money for what was framed as a consulting arrangement, but was really a paid relationship for information. Chloe had been the one who knew what to do with the information once they had it. She had connected it to an outside investor group that was positioning against one of Frank's acquisitions, and the result had been a failed deal that cost Frank approximately $8 million, and more practically, a partnership he had spent 4 years building. They had done it because they thought he was about to cut them out of the succession entirely. They had received wrong information from someone who didn't know what they were talking about, and instead of asking Frank directly, they had decided to damage him preemptively as a way of strengthening their own position. It had worked, in the narrow sense that the acquisition failed and Frank spent the following year in a difficult position with several of his partners. But it had also told Frank, with complete clarity, exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. He had already had his doubts. After that, he had no doubts at all. He didn't respond immediately because he didn't want to respond immediately. He wanted to think. He wanted to be sure. He also wanted to know if they would do it again, or try something else, or reveal some additional dimension of their thinking that might matter. He watched for about 8 months before he concluded that he had everything he needed to understand the full picture. Then he went silent and started building. The thing about the shell companies, Edwin's 7 subsidiaries, was that the environmental violations associated with them were real. This is worth being clear about. Frank hadn't manufactured the liability. The violations had happened in the 1980s and 1990s. They had been documented at the time by the relevant agencies, and they had remained unresolved because of the legal complexity of the shell structure, and because nobody had applied sufficient pressure to force a resolution. Frank applied the pressure himself. He did it by hiring the right environmental attorneys and giving them access to records that the agencies had never received, records that Frank had found in his father's files after Edwin died. He did it by facilitating the connection between a group of former workers from one of the subsidiary plants and a labor attorney who had been working on a wage theft case that had gone nowhere for lack of documentation. The documentation Frank provided didn't come from nowhere. It was real, it was accurate, and it turned a stalled case into an active one. This is the part that's uncomfortable to sit with, because what Frank did was technically use real injustice as a tool. The environmental damage was real. The labor violations were real. The people who had been affected by both had legitimate claims. Frank's decision to activate those claims as part of a strategy to destroy his family was effective partly because it was built on real harm that deserved to be addressed. Whether that makes it better or worse probably depends on you. What it meant practically was that the liability Frank transferred to Bev, Greg, and Chloe wasn't invented. It couldn't be challenged on the grounds of fraud because it was accurate. The document was legal and was reviewed and signed without duress in front of a licensed attorney. The indemnification language was clear to anyone who read it carefully. The liability was documented and filed and assigned through proper channels. There was no avenue for undoing it that the three of them could find, and their attorneys, separately retained, quickly engaged. told them so within the first week. Frank left Whitmore County 11 days after the signing. He had already arranged what he was going to do next, which had nothing to do with the Nash group or any of the people in that library. He had a small property in another state, bought 4 years earlier through a trust, under a name that wasn't Nash. It wasn't large. It had a library, which was apparently the one thing Frank considered non-negotiable. He had a few people he kept in contact with, Aldrich, the environmental attorneys, Toby occasionally, but mostly he had a level of quiet that he had not been able to access in decades. He didn't follow what happened to Bev and Greg and Chloe. He had Aldrich provide one brief summary report about 2 months after the signing, confirming that the proceedings were moving forward, that no legal challenge was viable, and that the three of them were in the process of losing what they had. Frank read it once, put it in a folder, and didn't ask for another one. The people who had been hurt by Edwin's companies were getting something. Not everything they were owed, probably not even close, but something. The labor case settled. The environmental remediation obligation was being enforced. The machinery that Frank had set in motion to make those outcomes happen was separate from the machinery he had set in motion to transfer the liability, but the two had moved forward together, and they were still moving. Whether Frank saw that as part of the point or just as a byproduct is something that only Frank could tell you. And Frank, as established, was not particularly interested in explaining himself. Bev sold the first property in the spring. She had to. The proceeds went almost entirely to the creditors, and what was left was less than she had spent on a single charity dinner 3 years before. She moved into a rental apartment in a part of the city she had spent 20 years driving through without stopping. The socialite infrastructure, the lunches, the committees, the particular kind of social architecture that requires money to maintain, was gone within 6 months, not because people stopped inviting her, but because she stopped being able to afford to show up in the way that those invitations assumed. Greg's situation collapsed faster and harder. It collapsed fast because his existing debts caught up with him almost immediately once the new liability was attached, and hard because he had more people to disappoint in the process. The car was gone first. The house went through a process that took longer than it should have because Greg hired the wrong attorney at the wrong price and spent time he didn't have on challenges that didn't work. By the summer, he was living in a situation that would have been unrecognizable to the version of him who had sat down at Frank's desk 8 months earlier, feeling like he was finally about to get what he deserved. Chloe was perhaps the most interesting case, in the dispassionate sense of the word. She was the youngest and the sharpest, and she had fewer dependents on her financial situation, which gave her slightly more room. But the professional network she had built was largely dependent on a perception of access to the Nash Group's resources that evaporated completely. The investor relationships dried up. The consulting work stopped coming. She was not broke in the way that Greg was broke, but she was reduced in a way that seemed, from the outside, to bother her more than the money itself. She was reduced in terms of what people assumed about her when she walked into a room, and for Chloe that might have been the actual currency that mattered most. None of the three were communicating with each other by the summer. When you take away the common project, and the common project had always been Frank's money, there apparently wasn't much else there. Frank's 63rd birthday passed without note. He spent it reading. He had been working through a collection of natural history texts that had belonged to his wife, who had died for years before the signing after a long illness that Frank had spent the majority of his internal resources on during the same period he was building the plan. Her death had not changed the plan. He had already decided what he was going to do, and her absence didn't alter that, though it may have changed something about the particular quality of the quiet he was now living in. He had photographs of her in the new house, which was the only personal detail that the very few people who visited remarked on. Not many photographs. He wasn't the kind of person who covered walls with them. Just a few, placed the way you place things when they matter, but you don't want to make a presentation of it. Toby came to visit once, about 5 months after the signing. They ate dinner, and Frank showed him a book about a species of bird that had been presumed extinct and had been found again, which was the kind of thing Frank found interesting. They didn't talk about the library or the documents or what had happened to the 3 people whose lives had been restructured by a Tuesday evening in November. Before he left, Toby mentioned that his environmental law work had recently connected him to one of the cases that had been activated by Frank's attorneys. He didn't say this as a question or an accusation. He just mentioned it, with the careful neutrality of someone laying something on a table and waiting to see if it needs to be picked up. Frank looked at him for a moment, then said that he was glad it was moving forward. And that was the end of that. The version of this story that people tend to want goes like this. Frank won, they lost, justice was served, everyone can feel satisfied and go home. That version is available, and it's not untrue. The factual sequence does end with Frank free and solvent and quiet, and the 3 people who spent years calculating how to take from him spending their own years dealing with consequences they signed their names to. But something about that summary leaves out the weight of it, the weight being that Frank spent 6 years building this. 6 years is a long time to carry something like that. 6 years of knowing what they did and choosing every morning to hold the response inside rather than release it. Whatever that kind of patience costs, and it costs something, it always costs something, Frank paid it. He didn't get to be angry. Anger is fast, and then it's over. Whatever he was doing in those 6 years wasn't fast, and it wasn't the kind of thing you walk away from unchanged. He built what he built, and it worked the way he designed it, and then he left and went to live in a house with books and photographs. And that's where the story ends, because there's nothing past that point that belongs to this story. The library rug at the Nash estate was cleaned, eventually. The wine stain came out, mostly. The estate itself was absorbed into the regulatory proceedings. It was among the largest single assets that Bev and Greg had jointly claimed partial interest in through a separate filing, and it became part of the settlement structure. Last anyone checked, it was being assessed for remediation purposes, which is maybe the most appropriate thing that building was ever used for. The heavy oak desk is still in the library. Nobody seems to know what to do with it. This was Revenge Chronicles. Frank Nash didn't raise his voice once. He just waited until they handed him the pen.